Kevin Costner not being one of them, Kevin being a good guy. There were other people involved with that were not good guys to me. Once I said, hey, how about if we do this and that, maybe we could do some things together.
Hollywood has always loved a good villain story, and for years, Val Kilmer played that role off-screen just as convincingly as he did on it. The narrative was familiar and well-rehearsed. Brilliant actor, impossible personality, a nightmare to work with. Directors complained, studios whispered, and co-stars kept their distance. That was the version of Val Kilmer that the industry had collectively agreed upon. But after Kilmer's death in April 2025, an old interview with Kurt Russell began circulating again, and what Russell had to say didn't just challenge that narrative, it dismantled it entirely. The truth about Val Kilmer, it turned out, was far more human, far more layered, and far more moving than the legend anyone had bothered to tell. To understand what Russell said and why it mattered so much, you first have to understand the circumstances under which these two men met, because the production of Tombstone in 1993 was not a calm, controlled environment where friendships are easily formed. It was, by almost every account, a production in genuine crisis. The film began with Kevin Jarre, the screenwriter himself, set to direct. That arrangement lasted roughly a month before Jarre was removed from the project, reportedly overwhelmed by the scale of what he had taken on and falling dangerously behind schedule. This wasn't a quiet reshuffling in the early planning stages. Cameras were already rolling. Sets had been built. The cast was assembled. A month into actual filming, the director was gone, and the entire production was left scrambling for direction, both literally and figuratively. George Cosmatos was brought in as the replacement. Cosmatos was an experienced director with credentials that included Rambo, First Blood Part 2, so on paper the hire made sense. But Cosmatos reportedly came aboard with barely 2 days of preparation time, which in the context of a production as complex and ambitious as Tombstone was essentially nothing. The real story of what happened next only emerged years later, when Kurt Russell gave an interview in 2006 and spoke candidly about the unconventional arrangement that had kept the film alive. According to Russell, he was the one effectively steering the production from behind the scenes. Every night, after filming wrapped, Russell would sit down and draw up detailed shot lists for the following day, which Cosmatos would then execute on set. Russell never took a directing credit. The arrangement was unorthodox, quiet, and entirely driven by one actor's refusal to let a film he believed in fall apart. He held the whole thing together through sheer force of will, creative investment, and a level of responsibility that went far beyond what any actor typically signs on for. And while all of this was happening, while Russell was simultaneously playing Wyatt Earp in front of the camera and quietly directing the film behind it, Val Kilmer was on set playing Doc Holliday. Val Kilmer, whose reputation at that point in his career was, to put it generously, complicated. Kilmer was a Juilliard-trained actor who approached his work with an intensity that was genuinely rare in the industry. He didn't simply learn lines and hit marks. He inhabited characters completely, sometimes in ways that made the people around him uncomfortable. Stories about difficult behavior on set had followed him for years. Directors had found him frustrating. Studios had found him exhausting. The whisper network about Kilmer's temperament was loud enough that by the time Tombstone came around, it had essentially become established fact in Hollywood circles. He was talented, nobody seriously disputed that, but working with him was understood to be a particular kind of challenge. So when you put all of those elements together, a director who was replaced a month in, a replacement who arrived with almost no preparation time, a major star secretly pulling creative strings from the shadows, and Hollywood's most famously difficult actor in a lead role, what you have sounds like a production designed to collapse under its own weight. A disaster in slow motion, waiting for the right moment to fall apart completely. Except that is not what happened. Tombstone did not collapse. It survived all of that chaos and came out the other side as one of the most beloved Westerns ever made, a film that people are still watching and quoting and debating more than 30 years later. And the question of how that happened leads you directly back to Kurt Russell and what he eventually said about the man beside him on set. In January 2024, Russell sat down with GQ for a wide-ranging career retrospective. The conversation covered decades of an extraordinary filmography, his early work, his iconic action roles, the films that had defined different eras of his career. When it turned to Tombstone, and specifically to his experience working with Val Kilmer, Russell didn't offer the kind of carefully managed, diplomatically vague answers that tend to characterize Hollywood interviews about complicated subjects. He was direct. He acknowledged that Kilmer's reputation was real and well known. Nobody in the industry was pretending otherwise. But then he said something that reframed the entire conversation. Russell told GQ that his relationship with Kilmer on that set had been one of tremendous trust, not tolerance, not management, not a professional arrangement held together by mutual respect for the work. Trust, genuine, creative, personal trust. He described the two of them as being in sync throughout filming, always thinking along the same lines, always moving toward the same understanding of what the film needed to be. For a production as pressured and chaotic as Tombstone, that kind of alignment between the two lead actors wasn't just pleasant, it was essential. It may well have been what saved the whole thing. Russell went further. He said without qualification or hedging that what Kilmer did with Doc Holliday was something very few actors could come close to matching. He called the performance brilliant. That word, brilliant, coming from Kurt Russell, a man who has shared screens with some of the most accomplished performers of the past half-century, carries genuine weight. This was not a compliment offered out of politeness or social obligation. Russell had the experience and the perspective to make that kind of judgment calibrated and meaningful, and he made it anyway. He said it clearly, on the record, in an interview conducted more than a year before Kilmer's death. There was no grief tour context here, no eulogy to manage, no public image to protect. Russell was simply telling the truth about a man he respected at a moment when there was no particular incentive to do so beyond honesty. The detail that has perhaps captured people's attention most powerfully is the story of what the two men gave each other when Tombstone finished filming. Russell explained to GQ that it had been somewhat customary in that era for actors to exchange gifts at the end of a long shoot, not obligatory, just something that sometimes happened organically between people who had been through something genuinely difficult together. After Tombstone wrapped, Russell wanted to give Kilmer something that actually reflected the experience they had shared and the characters they had lived inside for months. He gathered some of Kilmer's props from the film, the holster, the gun, the hat, the chair with Kilmer's name on it, had them photographed as a keepsake, and then added one final touch that was perfectly, darkly, hilariously calibrated to the character Kilmer had played. He bought Val Kilmer a burial plot at Boothill Graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona, the actual Boothill, the historic cemetery where figures from the real Old West are buried, the same place referenced throughout the film itself. Russell's reasoning was rooted entirely in the character of Doc Holliday, a dying man defined by his relationship with death, who carried that awareness into every scene with a kind of fearless, sardonic grace. A burial plot, Russell felt, was exactly the right gift for the man who had made that character live. What Russell did not know, and what he only discovered afterward, was that Kilmer had independently prepared a gift of his own, and the symmetry of what Kilmer had chosen is the kind of detail that makes this story genuinely remarkable. Val Kilmer had bought Kurt Russell an acre of land overlooking Boothill Graveyard. No coordination, no discussion, no knowledge of what the other person was planning. Kilmer, who had spent months playing a man consumed by death and dying, gave Russell the living man's view. Land above the cemetery, looking down. Russell, who had played Wyatt Earp, a man defined by survival and persistence, gave Kilmer a place in the ground. The living and the dead, the grave and the view above it. Two men who had worked together so closely, who had been so genuinely in sync throughout the entire production, that they independently expressed their friendship in the exact same metaphor without exchanging a single word about it. Russell pointed out that symmetry in the GQ interview, clearly still moved by it decades later. That is not a coincidence. That is two people operating on the same creative and emotional wavelength at a level that goes beyond ordinary professional connection. Kilmer's own account of their relationship predates the GQ interview by several years and is equally striking. In 2017, he wrote a lengthy post on his personal blog addressing the long-running question of who had really directed Tombstone. He was clear and unequivocal. Kurt is solely responsible for Tombstone's success, Kilmer wrote. No question. He described watching Russell sacrifice his own energy and his own performance to serve the film as a whole, working through the nights on shot lists, thinking about the movie as a complete piece of storytelling, while simultaneously preparing to inhabit one of the most iconic figures in American frontier history. Kilmer was clearly moved by what he had witnessed. He made an important distinction about Cosmatos. The credit wasn't fraudulent, and Cosmatos did direct the film, but the creative investment, the relentless behind-the-scenes work, the refusal to let the production collapse was Russell's, and Kilmer wanted that acknowledged. Everyone cared, Kilmer wrote, but Kurt put his money where his mouth was. Two men, two separate accounts made independently, years apart, each publicly crediting the other with making one of the most beloved films either of them ever appeared in. Neither statement made in the context of grief or PR management or any external pressure to be generous. Both made freely, honestly, and with the full weight of experience behind them. Val Kilmer died on April 1, 2025, at the age of 65. His daughter Mercedes confirmed that the cause of death was pneumonia. Kilmer had been dealing with serious health challenges for years. He was first diagnosed with throat cancer in 2014, and while he had eventually recovered from the disease itself, the treatments had left lasting damage. He had undergone 2 tracheotomies that significantly affected his ability to speak. His return to screens in Top Gun, Maverick in 2022, reprising the role of Iceman more than 35 years after the original, required AI technology to reconstruct his voice. Even so, he showed up. He appeared on screen again in a role that had meant something to him, under circumstances that must have been enormously difficult. That says a great deal about who he was. Tributes came from across the industry. Tom Cruise, Francis Ford Coppola, Cher, Jim Carrey, and many others. Social media filled with clips of his greatest performances. And within days of his death, that January 2024 GQ interview resurfaced and spread everywhere, because suddenly it was being read not as a career retrospective, but as something closer to a final testament. Kurt Russell, already on record, already having said everything that needed to be said, before either of them knew how little time remained. The real truth that Russell revealed was not a scandal or a revelation about behind-the-scenes conflict. It was something quieter and more lasting than that. The Val Kilmer that Russell knew was not simply a difficult actor whose talent made the difficulty worth tolerating. He was a trusted creative partner, someone whose instincts aligned with Russell's at every turn, someone whose performance rose to a level that Russell, with all his experience, felt compelled to call something very few actors could touch. The complicated reputation was never the whole story. It was never even close to the whole story. And now, with Kilmer gone, Kurt Russell's words, spoken freely before the loss, with no agenda beyond honesty, may stand as one of the most meaningful parts of how Val Kilmer is ultimately remembered.